Rebecca Martinez adjusted her window shade for the third time as United Flight 447 cruised smoothly at 35,000 feet. The December afternoon sun streamed through the small oval window, casting geometric shadows across her worn paperback novel. To her fellow passengers, she looked like any other traveler returning from a week in London, tired, slightly rumpled, eager to get home to Denver. Her jeans were faded, her navy sweater unremarkable, and her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail that revealed nothing of the woman she used to be. But old habits died hard. While other passengers dozed, watched movies, or scrolled through their phones, Rebecca found herself unconsciously monitoring the aircraft's behavior. The subtle vibration changes as they hit pockets of turbulence. The barely perceptible shift in engine pitch during routine adjustments. The way the cabin pressure felt against her eardrums during minor altitude changes. These were details that meant nothing to civilian passengers, but spoke volumes to someone who had once trusted her life to similar aircraft systems. Every single day, she caught herself doing it again and forced her attention back to her book, a thriller about corporate espionage that held none of the real tension she'd experienced in her previous life. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was trying to escape into fiction when her own past read like something from a military adventure novel. Fighter pilot, aircraft carrier landings, combat missions over hostile territory. A distinguished service record that had ended not in glory, but in a court-martial that stripped away everything she'd worked for. 5 years ago, Major Rebecca Martinez had been one of the Navy's most promising aviators. She'd flown FA-18 Super Hornets off the deck of the USS Theodore Roosevelt, executed precision strikes in 3 different theaters of operation, and earned commendations for her exceptional flying skills and tactical judgment. Her colleagues respected her. Her superiors trusted her with the most challenging missions. She was being fast-tracked for squadron command. Then came the incident that changed everything. During a routine training exercise, her squadron leader had made a tactical error that put 2 aircraft on a collision course. Standard protocol demanded radio communication through the chain of command, but there hadn't been time. Rebecca had broken formation without authorization, positioning her aircraft to force both pilots into evasive maneuvers that prevented what would have been a catastrophic mid-collision. Her split-second decision had saved 2 lives and 2 multi-million-dollar aircraft. It had also violated direct orders, broken chain of command, and embarrassed a squadron leader who happened to be the son of a senior admiral. The subsequent investigation focused not on the lives saved, but on the insubordination displayed. Despite testimony from the pilots she'd saved, despite expert analysis confirming that her intervention had prevented disaster, the court-martial panel ruled that unauthorized deviation from orders, regardless of outcome, could not be tolerated in military aviation. Major Rebecca Martinez was stripped of her commission, her pension, and her identity. Now she worked as a technical writer for an aerospace consulting firm in Denver, translating complex engineering specifications into language that government contractors could understand. It was steady work that utilized her technical knowledge while keeping her far from anything that might remind her of what she'd lost. She lived in a small apartment, drove a reliable Honda, and had built a quiet life that asked nothing more of her than competent anonymity. The flight attendant's voice broke through her memories. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our initial descent into Denver International Airport. Please return your seatbacks and tray tables to their upright positions." Rebecca glanced at her watch. They were still 2 hours out from Denver, which meant this was probably a routine altitude adjustment rather than final approach. But something in the flight attendant's tone seemed slightly off, too controlled, like someone working hard to sound normal. She looked around the cabin more carefully. Ashley Turner, the senior flight attendant, was moving through the aisles with practiced efficiency, but her smile seemed forced. Near the front of the cabin, Louise Morales, the younger flight attendant, kept glancing toward the cockpit door with an expression that Rebecca recognized from her military days. The look of someone who knew something was wrong, but wasn't sure what to do about it. Rebecca felt the familiar tingle of situational awareness that had kept her alive through countless missions. Something was happening that the passengers weren't being told about. The question was whether it was routine operational procedure or something more serious. She closed her book and began paying closer attention to the aircraft's behavior. Engine noise was steady, the flight path smooth, no obvious mechanical issues. But there was something in the cabin atmosphere, a tension that went beyond normal. Pre-landing procedures. In seat 12A, she noticed a man in his 40s with the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement. His clothes were civilian, but his posture and the way his eyes constantly scanned the cabin marked him as security, probably an air marshal, though he was doing a decent job of blending in with the business travelers. Rebecca settled back in her seat and tried to convince herself that she was overthinking things. 5 years of civilian life should have dulled her military instincts, taught her to see ordinary situations as ordinary rather than potential threats. But those instincts had been honed through years of training and combat experience. They weren't easily ignored. The aircraft hit a patch of turbulence, nothing severe, but enough to make the cabin shudder slightly. Around her, passengers grabbed their armrests and looked mildly concerned. But Rebecca felt something else, a subtle change in the aircraft's trim that suggested the pilots were making corrections beyond what the turbulence required. She found herself unconsciously cataloging the aircraft systems, remembering the technical specifications of the Boeing 737-800. Twin engines, fly-by-wire controls, redundant hydraulic systems, a reliable aircraft with an excellent safety record. But like any complex machine, vulnerable to the unexpected combination of circumstances that could turn routine operations into emergency situations. The flight attendant call button chimed from somewhere near the front of the cabin, then again, then a third time in quick succession. Rebecca watched Ashley Turner's face as she moved toward the sound and saw the professional mask slip for just an instant long enough to reveal genuine concern. That's when Rebecca knew that whatever was happening, it was more than routine. Turbulence or schedule adjustments. Something was wrong in the cockpit of Flight 447, and she was probably the only passenger on board with the experience to understand what that might mean. She kept her expression neutral and her body language relaxed. But inside, the instincts that had made her one of the Navy's finest pilots were awakening from 5 years of dormancy. Whether she wanted it or not, whether she was ready for it or not, Rebecca Martinez was about to be reminded that some skills never completely fade away. The question was whether she would have the courage to use them if the moment came. 20 minutes passed before Rebecca's suspicions were confirmed. The subtle signs she'd been monitoring: inconsistent altitude adjustments, extended periods without pilot announcements, the increasingly nervous behavior of the flight crew had painted a picture that her military training refused to ignore. Something was seriously wrong in the cockpit of Flight 447. The revelation came when Ashley Turner made her way down the aisle with a medical kit, moving with the kind of purposeful urgency that flight attendants were trained to mask from passengers. She paused at row 8, where Dr. Vincent Gray sat, reading a medical journal, and leaned down to whisper something that made the doctor's face immediately shift from casual interest to professional concern. Rebecca watched Dr. Gray follow Ashley toward the front of the aircraft and noticed other details that confirmed her growing fears. Luis Morales had positioned himself near the cockpit door, ostensibly organizing service items, but actually standing guard. The man she'd identified as an Air Marshal Agent Derek Coleman, though she didn't know his name yet, had subtly shifted in his seat to get a better view of the cockpit area. These weren't the movements of crew members dealing with a routine medical issue among passengers. This was the coordinated response of people managing a crisis they couldn't announce without causing panic among 127 people. Trapped in a metal tube 7 miles above the Atlantic Ocean, Rebecca's mind automatically began running through possibilities. Medical emergency involving the flight crew. Mechanical failure requiring pilot attention. Security threat that demanded discreet handling. But the combination of a doctor being summoned and the air marshal's alertness suggested something specific, a medical crisis affecting the people responsible for flying the plane. Her military training had taught her to gather intelligence before acting, so she waited and watched. 5 minutes later, Dr. Gray emerged from behind the curtain separating first class from the cockpit area. His expression was grim as he spoke quietly with Ashley Turner, their conversation too distant for passengers to overhear, but their body language speaking volumes to anyone trained to read such signals. The air marshal had noticed the same things Rebecca had. She watched him make a discreet phone call, probably to ground control or federal authorities, his voice too low to catch specific words, but his posture indicating he was reporting a developing situation. When he ended the call, he remained in his seat, but Rebecca could see him calculating angles and distances, the same kind of tactical assessment she'd made countless times during her naval service. That's when the announcement came, delivered by Ashley Turner with the kind of forced calm that fooled no one who knew what to listen for. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some minor technical difficulties that require us to divert to Boston Logan International Airport. This is purely precautionary, and we expect to land in approximately 45 minutes. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Minor technical difficulties. The euphemism that covered everything from hydraulic leaks to engine failures to crew medical emergencies. Rebecca had heard similar announcements during her military career, and she knew that minor often meant potentially catastrophic in aviation terminology. Around her, passengers responded with the usual mixture of annoyance and mild concern. Missed connections, delayed meetings, inconvenience rather than fear. They trusted that the crew would handle whatever was happening, just as they trusted that the engines would keep running and the wings would stay attached. That trust was usually well-founded. But Rebecca knew that aviation safety depended on having qualified personnel ready to manage situations when trust wasn't enough. The aircraft began a gradual descent, and Rebecca felt the slight pressure. Change that indicated they were losing altitude faster than normal approach procedures required. Emergency descent profile. Not the kind used for routine schedule changes or minor mechanical issues. This was the flight path of an aircraft that needed to get on the ground as quickly as safely possible. Her training kicked in automatically. She began cataloging emergency procedures for the Boeing 737-800, reviewing systems redundancies and failure modes that she'd studied during her transition from military to civilian aircraft knowledge. The 737 was a robust platform with multiple backup systems, but it still required human pilots to manage those systems during emergencies. If something had happened to Captain Nathan Price and First Officer Megan Shaw, the thought sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the aircraft's air conditioning. Rebecca had faced enemy fire, equipment failures, and weather conditions that would ground most civilian flights. But she'd always faced those challenges as part of a team with backup aircraft nearby and emergency procedures specifically designed for military operations. Commercial aviation operated under different rules, with different safety margins and different assumptions about who would be available to handle crisis situations. She found herself studying the other passengers with new eyes, looking for anyone who might have relevant experience. A few business travelers who might have private pilot licenses. some younger passengers who could potentially assist with evacuation procedures, but no one who showed the kind of situational awareness that suggested military or professional aviation background. Except for the air marshal, who was now making more frequent glances toward the cockpit area and had positioned his carry-on bag where he could access it quickly. His movements were becoming less discreet, suggesting that whatever was happening had progressed beyond the point where normal cover protocols mattered. Rebecca made a decision that would have seemed impossible 5 years ago. She unbuckled her seatbelt and made her way toward the front of the cabin, moving with the casual confidence of someone heading to the restroom, but actually positioning herself where she could better assess the situation. As she passed row 12, Agent Coleman looked up and made eye contact. For just an instant, she saw a recognition there, not of her identity, but of her bearing. The way she moved, the way she observed her surroundings, the subtle alertness that marked someone with tactical training. He didn't stop her, but she felt his attention tracking her movement toward the front of the aircraft. Near the galley area, Rebecca could hear fragments of conversation between Ashley Turner and Louise. Morale's words like unresponsive and tried everything, and how long that confirmed her worst fears about what was happening behind the cockpit door. When Ashley noticed her standing nearby, Rebecca made another decision that surprised her with its clarity. "I couldn't help but notice that you seem to be dealing with a serious situation," she said quietly. "I have experience that might be helpful." Ashley's professional training kicked in immediately. "Ma'am, I need you to return to your seat. We have everything under control." "I'm sure you do," Rebecca replied. "But I'm also sure that if you're dealing with a flight crew medical emergency, you're going to need someone with aviation experience. To help manage this situation, I have that experience." The flight attendant's expression shifted from polite dismissal to sharp attention. "What kind of experience?" "The kind that might be the difference between landing this aircraft safely and not landing it at all." As the words left her mouth, Rebecca realized that she had just volunteered to step back into the world she'd spent 5 years trying to forget. But with 127 lives potentially depending on decisions that would be made in the next hour, her personal history seemed far less important than her professional capabilities. The question now was whether anyone would listen to a disgraced former Navy pilot who wasn't supposed to be anything more than a passenger in seat 14C. Ashley Turner's eyes narrowed as she studied Rebecca's face, searching for signs of deception or delusion. Flight attendants were trained to handle all kinds of passenger situations, medical emergencies, unruly travelers, people claiming expertise they didn't possess. But there was something in this woman's bearing that didn't fit the usual patterns of civilian passengers trying to insert themselves into crew operations. "What specific aviation experience are you talking about?" Ashley asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Naval aviation, fighter jets, aircraft carrier operations. 15 years of flying everything from training aircraft to combat missions." Rebecca kept her voice equally quiet, aware that other passengers were beginning to notice their conversation. "I know you probably get people claiming they can help, but I also know you're facing something serious enough that you called for a doctor, and have been in contact with the cockpit for the past 20 minutes without any pilot announcements." Before Ashley could respond, Dr. Gray emerged from the first-class section, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly as he approached them. The medical bag he carried seemed heavier than when he'd taken it forward, and his professional composure showed cracks that made Rebecca's stomach tighten with dread. "Ashley," Dr. Gray said, his voice carefully controlled, "I need to speak with you privately, now." The three of them moved into the small galley area between first class and the cockpit, where Louise Morales was already waiting with an expression that confirmed Rebecca's worst fears. Whatever was happening behind that cockpit door had progressed beyond routine medical assistance. Both pilots are unconscious, Dr. Gray said without preamble. Captain Price collapsed first, approximately 30 minutes ago. First Officer Shaw tried to maintain control, but succumbed to the same symptoms about 10 minutes later. I've checked their vital signs. They're stable but completely unresponsive. Pulse, blood pressure, and breathing are normal, but neither shows any response to verbal or physical stimuli. Ashley's face went white. How is that possible? Food poisoning? Some kind of contamination? I don't know. The symptoms don't match any standard toxicity profile I'm familiar with. It could be something in the air supply, though that should affect passengers too. Could be something they both consumed that no one else had access to. Could be some kind of deliberate poisoning, though that seems unlikely given the security protocols for flight crews. Rebecca felt the pieces clicking together in her mind, not the medical cause, which was beyond her expertise, but the operational implications that these civilian crew members might not fully grasp. Who's flying the plane right now? She asked. Autopilot, Luis answered. The aircraft is still following its programmed flight path, but ... But autopilot isn't designed to handle emergencies, weather changes, or landing procedures, Rebecca finished. It's a temporary solution, not a permanent one. How long before you need active pilot control? Dr. Gray looked confused by the question, but Ashley understood immediately. We're supposed to begin approach procedures for Boston in about 20 minutes. The air traffic controllers are expecting pilot communication for landing clearance. And if no one can communicate with them, they'll assume we're having radio problems and vector other aircraft away from our approach path. They can talk us down using the radio, but Ashley's voice trailed off as she realized the full implications. But they can't actually land the plane, Rebecca said. They can give instructions, but someone in the cockpit has to execute them. Someone who understands flight controls, approach procedures, and emergency protocols. The silence that followed was broken by Agent Coleman's voice from directly behind them. Excuse me, but I couldn't help overhearing the conversation about pilot incapacitation. His credentials were already in his hand. Federal Air Marshal Derek Coleman, with the kind of authority that commanded immediate attention. I need to understand the exact nature of our situation. Ashley looked relieved to have someone with official authority take charge. Agent Coleman, both our pilots are unconscious. We have autopilot maintaining flight path, but we're going to need human intervention for landing procedures. Coleman's expression remained professional, but Rebecca could see the calculations running behind his eyes, the same tactical assessment she'd been making about options, timelines, and available resources. Do either of you have pilot training? Basic emergency procedures only, Ashley replied. Nothing that would qualify us to actually fly the aircraft. Coleman's attention turned to Rebecca. Ma'am, I heard you mention naval aviation experience. Can you be more specific about your qualifications? This was the moment Rebecca had been dreading for 5 years, having to explain not just her capabilities, but why those capabilities were no longer officially recognized. Major Rebecca Martinez, former FA-18 pilot with carrier qualifications. 3,000 flight hours, including combat operations and emergency procedures. She paused, knowing the next part would change how they saw her. Court-martialed and discharged 5 years ago for insubordination. The last part hung in the air like a challenge. Coleman's expression didn't change, but she could see him processing the information, weighing her claimed expertise against the obvious question of why someone with those qualifications was no longer in military service. What kind of insubordination? He asked. The kind that saved 2 lives and 2 aircraft by violating direct orders from a superior officer, who was making a tactical error that would have resulted in a mid-air collision. Coleman studied her face for several long seconds. Around them, the aircraft continued its steady descent toward Boston, the autopilot dutifully following programming that would soon require human intervention to complete safely. "Can you land this aircraft?" he asked finally. "Yes," Rebecca replied without hesitation, "but not from a passenger seat. I need access to the cockpit controls, and I need to understand what caused the pilot's condition to make sure it doesn't." "Affect me the same way," Dr. Gray spoke up. "I've been thinking about that. If it's something environmental contaminated air supply, chemical exposure, then anyone entering the cockpit could be at risk. But if it's something they ingested, or some other vector that doesn't affect the cockpit environment, then the aircraft systems should be safe to operate. The question is whether we're willing to take that risk," Agent Coleman said. Rebecca looked at each of them in turn. The flight attendants who were trained for customer service and basic emergency procedures, the doctor whose expertise was medical rather than aviation, and the federal agent whose job was law enforcement rather than flying aircraft. "Agent Coleman," she said, "I'm going to need you to prove I know what I'm talking about before I authorize anyone to enter that cockpit." Rebecca nodded. She had expected this, the need to demonstrate competence before being trusted with 127 lives. The irony wasn't lost on her that she would have to prove herself to people who had no aviation experience, but that was the reality of her situation. "Ask me anything about Boeing 737-800 systems, emergency procedures, or approach protocols," she said. "I'll walk you through exactly what needs to happen to get this aircraft safely on the ground." As Coleman began formulating his questions, Rebecca realized that the next few minutes would determine not just whether she would be allowed to help, but whether 127 people would live or die based on decisions she'd made 5 years ago that had cost her everything she'd worked for. The test of her life was about to begin, and this time there would be no court martial afterward to judge her actions, only the simple verdict of success or catastrophic failure. Agent Coleman's questioning was methodical and precise, the kind of systematic verification that law enforcement officers use to separate genuine expertise from dangerous overconfidence. But Rebecca had expected this interrogation, and her answers came with the automatic precision of someone whose knowledge had been tested under far more stressful conditions than a galley conversation at 35,000 feet. "Boeing 737-800 approach speed?" Coleman asked. "Depends on weight and conditions, but typically 130 to 150 knots. Lower with full flaps, higher in crosswind conditions. Emergency descent procedure. Reduce power, deploy speed brakes if available. Maintain maximum descent rate within structural limits. Monitor cabin pressure. Prepare for rapid altitude. Loss. Communicate with a TC about emergency status. Landing gear deployment sequence. Main gear first. Nose gear second. 3 green lights confirm proper deployment and lock. Manual backup systems available if hydraulics fail." Coleman fired questions for 5 minutes, covering everything from fuel management to hydraulic systems to radio protocols. Rebecca answered each one without hesitation, drawing on knowledge that she'd accumulated through thousands of hours of training and operational experience. More importantly, she explained not just the procedures, but the reasoning behind them, the kind of deep understanding that came from actually flying aircraft rather than just reading about them. Dr. Gray watched the exchange with growing amazement. "You really do know what you're talking about." "She does," Coleman agreed, his skepticism gradually giving way to professional respect. "But knowing procedures and actually executing them under pressure are different things. Ma'am, when was the last time you actually flew an aircraft?" 5 years, 2 months, and 16 days ago, Rebecca replied. The precision of her answer revealed how much that final flight had meant to her. But flying skills don't disappear like riding a bicycle. The muscle memory, the situational awareness, the decision-making processes, they're all still there. Before Coleman could respond, The aircraft's intercom crackled to life with an announcement that made everyone in the galley freeze. But instead of the confident voice of Captain Price or First Officer Shaw, they heard the strained tones of Luis Morales speaking from the cockpit. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your flight crew. We're experiencing some technical difficulties that require immediate attention. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, prepare for possible emergency. Procedures." The transmission ended with the click of the intercom being turned off, followed by Luce's voice calling urgently from the cockpit. "Ashley, I need help up here now." Ashley rushed toward the cockpit with Dr. Gray close behind, leaving Rebecca and Coleman standing in the galley as the reality of their situation crystallized around them. Whatever had happened to the pilots, the crisis was accelerating beyond the point where it could be managed quietly. Coleman made a decision that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to assess that cockpit situation. If you can really do what you claim, then you might be our only option." They moved toward the front of the aircraft, where Ashley was trying to manage a situation that was spiraling beyond her training. Through the open cockpit door, Rebecca could see Captain Price slumped forward in his seat, his headset hanging loose around his neck. First Officer Shaw was unconscious in the right seat, her body held upright only by her shoulder harness. But it was Luis Morales who commanded immediate attention. The young flight attendant was sitting in the jump seat behind the pilots, his face pale and his hands shaking as he stared at the array of instruments and controls that suddenly represented the difference between life and death for everyone aboard Flight 4-4-7. "I don't know what to do," he said as Ashley approached. "The radio keeps making noises, and there are lights flashing on the panel. The autopilot is still working, but they told me we need to start talking to the controllers about landing, and I don't know how to use any of this equipment." Dr. Gray was already examining both pilots, checking their vital signs and looking for any clues about what had caused their simultaneous collapse. "Same symptoms as before," he reported. "Stable vitals, but completely unresponsive. It's like they're in some kind of coma." Rebecca stepped into the cockpit doorway and immediately felt the familiar environment of an aircraft flight deck around her. The Boeing 737 cockpit was different from the FA-18 she'd flown, but the fundamental principles were the same: attitude indicators, engine instruments, navigation displays, radio controls. After 5 years of civilian life, being surrounded by flight controls felt like coming home. "Luis," she said quietly, "I need you to move to the passenger cabin. I'm going to take over here." The flight attendant looked up at her with desperate relief. "Do you know how to fly this plane?" "Yes, I do." Agent Coleman appeared behind her. "Ma'am, are you absolutely certain about this? Once you touch those controls, you're responsible for 127 lives." Rebecca looked at the unconscious pilots, then at the instrument panel where warning lights were beginning to flash as the autopilot systems struggled to maintain flight parameters without human supervision. The aircraft was still flying, but that situation was becoming increasingly unstable as they approached the complex airspace around Boston Logan International Airport. "Agent Coleman," she said, settling into the captain's seat, "I've been responsible for lives before. The question isn't whether I can do this. It's whether anyone else on this aircraft can." She began scanning the instrument panel, familiarizing herself with the specific layout and systems of the 737-800. Engine instruments showed normal operation. Fuel levels were adequate for approach and landing. Navigation systems were functioning properly. The autopilot was maintaining altitude and heading, but she could see indicators suggesting that air traffic control was trying to make contact for approach clearance. "Ashley," she called, "I need you to make an announcement to the passengers. Tell them we're experiencing crew medical issues, but that a qualified pilot is now in control of the aircraft." Don't give details, but let them know that everything is being handled professionally. As Ashley moved to make the announcement, Rebecca reached for the radio controls. 5 years of civilian life had ended the moment she'd sat down in the captain's seat. She was no longer Rebecca Martinez, disgraced ex-military pilot trying to blend into the background of ordinary life. She was Major Martinez, again aviator and officer responsible for bringing her aircraft and crew home safely. The radio crackled with the voice of Boston Approach Control. United 447, Boston Approach. You're approaching our airspace. Request confirmation of pilot status and landing intentions. Rebecca keyed the microphone, and when she spoke, her voice carried the calm authority of someone who had made similar transmissions under far more dangerous circumstances. Boston. Approach. United 447. This is emergency pilot in command. Original flight crew is incapacitated. I'm a qualified military aviator assuming aircraft control. Requesting priority landing clearance and emergency services standing by. The silence that followed her transmission seemed to stretch forever. Then Boston Approach responded with the kind of professional calm that marked experienced controllers dealing with situations they'd trained for, but hoped never to encounter. United 447, Boston Approach copies emergency pilot status. We're clearing runway 4 right for your approach. Emergency services are being notified. What is your flight experience level? Boston Approach, I'm military trained with. Carrier operations experience. I can handle the approach, but I'll need some assistance with 737 specific systems that differ from my usual aircraft. Roger, 447. We'll have Boeing technical advisors standing by to assist with any systems questions. Begin descent to flight level 200 and maintain current heading. As Rebecca began implementing the controller's instructions, she realized that the hardest part of her ordeal was just beginning. Getting the aircraft safely on the ground would require not just her flying skills, but the cooperation of people who had every reason to doubt her qualifications and the ability to manage a crisis that had already exceeded everyone's training and experience. But for the first time since boarding the flight, she felt completely in control of her situation. This was what she had trained for, what she was meant to do, and no court-martial or bureaucratic decision could take that away from her when it mattered most. The Boeing 737's flight controls felt foreign beneath Rebecca's hands after 5 years away from military aviation, but the fundamental principles of flight remained unchanged. She made small adjustments to the autopilot settings, beginning the descent that Boston Approach had requested, while simultaneously familiarizing herself with the aircraft's specific systems and limitations. Behind her, Dr. Gray continued his examination of both unconscious pilots, his frustration evident as he searched for answers that seemed increasingly elusive. "I've never seen anything like this," he muttered, checking Captain Price's pupils with a penlight. "All vital signs are completely normal, but neither of them shows any response to stimulus. It's like their brains have just shut down." Agent Coleman had positioned himself where he could monitor both the cockpit operations and the passenger cabin, his law enforcement training evident in the way he constantly assessed potential threats and security concerns. "Doctor, is there any chance this could be some kind of intentional poisoning? Something that could have been introduced deliberately?" "Possible, but unlikely," Dr. Gray replied. "The timing would have to be incredibly precise, and the delivery method would need to affect only the pilots without contaminating anyone else. Unless ... He paused, his expression shifting as a new possibility occurred to him. "Unless what?" Rebecca asked, her attention divided between the conversation and the increasingly complex task of managing the aircraft's descent through busy airspace. Unless it was something specific to the pilot's environment, something in the cockpit, air supply, or in food or drinks that only they had access to. Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the aircraft's air conditioning. If it's environmental contamination in the cockpit, then I could be at risk right now. We'll have to monitor you for any symptoms, Dr. Gray said. Dizziness, nausea, confusion, difficulty concentrating. If you start feeling anything unusual, report it immediately, Rebecca finished. But right now, I feel fine, and we need to focus on getting this aircraft safely on the ground before worrying about what might happen. The radio crackled with another transmission from Boston Approach. United 447, we have technical advisors from Boeing standing by to assist with any systems questions. Also, please advise passenger count and fuel status for emergency. Planning. Rebecca keyed the microphone. Boston Approach. United 447 Heavy with 127 souls on board. Fuel status is adequate for normal approach with standard reserves. No mechanical issues reported. Crew medical emergency only. Roger, 447. We're vectoring other traffic away from your approach path. Descend and maintain flight level 180, heading 0-9-0. As Rebecca implemented the new altitude and heading changes, she became aware of a subtle shift in the aircraft's behavior that hadn't been apparent when the autopilot was managing all flight controls. The 737 was responding normally to her inputs, but there was a slight asymmetry in the engine performance that suggested one of the pilots had been dealing with a minor mechanical issue before their incapacitation. Ashley, she called to the senior flight attendant. I need you to check the passenger cabin and make sure everyone is remaining calm. Also, see if anyone has aviation experience who might be able to assist up here. Ashley nodded and moved back into the cabin, where Rebecca could hear her making announcements designed to maintain passenger confidence while gathering information about potential additional resources. The murmur of concerned voices from the passenger compartment provided a constant reminder of how many people were depending on decisions she was making in real time. Agent Coleman moved closer to the cockpit controls. Ma'am, I need to ask about your court-martial. You mentioned insubordination, but I need to understand whether there were any issues with your judgment or flying capabilities that could affect this situation. Rebecca appreciated his directness. In a crisis, there wasn't time for diplomatic language or avoiding uncomfortable topics. My court-martial was for violating direct orders to prevent a mid-air collision during a training exercise. The ruling was that I should have followed the chain of command, even if it resulted in aircraft loss and pilot deaths. My flying skills were never questioned, only my willingness to follow orders that I believed were wrong. And now? Now there's no chain of command to violate. There's just an aircraft that needs to be landed safely and 127 people who need to get home to their families. The radio interrupted their conversation with an urgent transmission. United 447, Boston Approach. We're showing some irregularities in your flight path. Are you experiencing any control difficulties? Rebecca checked her instruments and immediately saw what the controllers were detecting. The slight engine asymmetry she'd noticed was becoming more pronounced, causing minor variations in the aircraft's heading and altitude that required constant correction. Whatever mechanical issue the original pilots had been managing was becoming more significant under the stress of emergency operations. Boston Approach, United 447. I'm detecting minor engine performance variations that may require manual compensation during approach. Nothing critical at this time, but I may need additional guidance for landing procedures. Roger, 447. We're coordinating with Boeing technical support to provide real-time assistance for any systems issues. Continue descent to flight level 1-0. As Rebecca implemented the continued descent, Dr. Gray's voice broke the concentration she needed for managing the increasingly complex flight situation. I think I may have found something, he said, his tone carrying the mixture of relief and concern that came with discovering a crucial piece of evidence. He was holding 2 small bottles that he'd apparently found in the cockpit area. Coffee. Thermos bottles, both still warm. Captain Price's and First Officer Shaw's names are written on them. Agent Coleman immediately understood the implications. If something was introduced into their coffee, that would explain the selective targeting and the timing of their incapacitation. But it would also mean, Dr. Gray continued, that whatever affected them is probably out of their systems by now. The question is whether they'll regain consciousness naturally or whether the damage is permanent. Rebecca felt the weight of responsibility settling even more heavily on her shoulders. If the pilots were going to remain unconscious for the duration of the flight, then she would be solely responsible for bringing Flight 447 safely to the ground. No backup, no second chances, no opportunities to transfer control to someone more qualified. The aircraft shuddered slightly as they passed through a layer of turbulence, and Rebecca made the minute adjustments necessary to maintain stable flight. But she also noticed something that made her stomach tighten with concern. Her hands were beginning to show the first signs of tremor that came from stress and a realization that she was operating far outside any safety net. Boston approach? She transmitted, United 447 requesting priority handling for approach and landing. I'm managing minor systems issues that may complicate normal procedures. United 447, Boston approach copies. You're cleared for straight-in approach to runway 4 right. Emergency services are standing by. We'll stay with you all the way to the ground. As the Massachusetts coastline became visible through the cockpit windows, Rebecca realized that the next 20 minutes would test everything she'd learned during 15 years of military aviation. But this time, the stakes weren't just her own life or career. They were the lives of 127 people who had trusted the system to keep them safe and who now depended entirely on someone the system had rejected 5 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was about to attempt the most important landing of her career using skills that officially didn't exist. In an aircraft she wasn't certified to fly, for people who had no idea that their lives depended on. Someone who had been court-martialed for the very kind of independent judgment that might be their only hope for survival. But as Flight 447 descended through 12,000 feet, Rebecca felt something she hadn't experienced in 5 years. The quiet confidence that came from knowing she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do, regardless of what any official record might say about her qualifications. At 8,000 feet, with Boston Logan International Airport visible through the windscreen, Flight 447 had become a different aircraft than the one that had departed London 6 hours earlier. The engine asymmetry that had started as a minor annoyance was now requiring constant correction, and Rebecca could see warning indicators beginning to illuminate on the engine management display. "Dr. Gray," she called without taking her eyes off the instruments. "Any change in the pilot's condition?" "Nothing," he replied, his frustration evident. "I've tried everything I can think of: ammonia capsules, pain stimulation, even cold water. They're breathing normally. Their hearts are strong, but it's like they're in some kind of deep coma." Agent Coleman had been monitoring radio transmissions between Boston approach and other aircraft in the area, and his expression grew increasingly grim as he listened to the coordination efforts taking place around their emergency. "Ma'am, they're treating this as a potential terrorism incident. FBI is being notified. Hazmat teams are being deployed, and they're considering the possibility that this aircraft might be carrying some kind of chemical or biological weapon." "Which means," Rebecca replied, making another small correction to compensate for the engine problem, "that even if we land safely, we're going to be treated as a potential threat rather than victims of whatever happened here." The thought added another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming situation. Not only did she need to successfully land the aircraft, but she would then have to convince federal authorities that she wasn't part of whatever plot had incapacitated the original pilots. Her military background and court-martial record would undoubtedly be scrutinized, and her decision to take control of the aircraft could easily be interpreted as suspicious rather than heroic. Ashley Turner returned from the passenger cabin with information that provided both relief and additional concern. "I found 2 passengers with private pilot licenses," she reported. A retired airline pilot named Frank Wilson, who's been out of service for 8 years, and a flight instructor named Helen Garcia, who teaches in small aircraft. "Bring them up here," Rebecca said immediately. "I can use all the help I can get." Frank Wilson arrived first, a distinguished man in his 70s, whose bearing still carried the confidence of someone who had spent decades in commercial aviation. But when he saw the cockpit situation, 2 unconscious pilots, warning lights flashing, and Rebecca managing increasingly complex systems, his expression shifted from curiosity to alarm. "Miss," he said carefully, "I don't know what your qualifications are, but this is a very sophisticated aircraft with systems that require specific training to operate safely." "Mr. Wilson," Rebecca replied, "I'm a former Navy pilot with 15 years of military aviation experience. I've flown everything from training aircraft to FA-18 Super Hornets in combat conditions. I appreciate your concern, but right now I need assistance, not a lecture about my qualifications." Wilson studied her technique as she made adjustments to the flight controls, his experienced eye evaluating her competence in real time. After several minutes of observation, his skepticism began to give way to professional respect. "You do know what you're doing," he admitted. "Your scan patterns are textbook, your control inputs are smooth, and you're managing that engine problem better than some commercial pilots I've worked with. What kind of training did you have on 737 systems?" "None," Rebecca replied honestly. "I'm flying this aircraft based on general aviation principles and what I can figure out from the instrument displays. That's why I need your help. You know these systems better than I do." Helen Garcia joined them in the crowded cockpit area and immediately began assisting with systems monitoring and checklist procedures. Her flight instructor background made her naturally suited to supporting rather than challenging Rebecca's authority, and her knowledge of civilian aviation procedures filled gaps that Rebecca's military training hadn't covered. "The engine warning lights are getting more persistent," Helen observed, pointing to the right engine display. "We may be looking at a degraded engine situation for landing." "Can this aircraft land safely on one engine?" Rebecca asked. "Yes," Frank Wilson answered, "but it requires specific procedures and much more precise speed and power management. The approach will be steeper, the touchdown will be harder, and there's much less margin for error." As if to emphasize his point, the right engine's warning indicators suddenly shifted from amber to red, and an automated voice filled the cockpit. "Engine failure! Engine failure! Right engine!" Rebecca's training kicked in immediately. She adjusted power settings, compensated for the sudden loss of thrust, and maintained aircraft control while the automated system cycled through emergency procedures. But she could feel the aircraft's behavior change dramatically heavier, less responsive, requiring constant attention to prevent drift or altitude loss. "Boston approach, United 447, she transmitted, her voice remarkably calm given the circumstances. "We've just experienced right engine failure. Declaring emergency and requesting immediate vectors for single-engine approach. United 447, Boston approach copies engine failure. You're cleared for immediate approach to runway 4 right. Emergency services are standing by. Do you require assistance with single-engine procedures?" "Affirmative, Boston approach. I'm military trained, but not familiar with 737 single-engine protocols." Agent Coleman watched the interchange with growing amazement. The woman who had boarded the aircraft as an anonymous passenger was now managing a multi-system emergency with the kind of professional competence that he associated with highly trained pilots. Her military bearing was unmistakable, the calm decision-making, the precise communications, the ability to prioritize critical tasks while managing multiple simultaneous problems. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. When you first claimed to be qualified for this, I thought you might be overestimating your abilities. I was wrong." "Agent Coleman," Rebecca replied while adjusting trim settings to compensate for the engine loss. "You were doing your job. In your position, I would have been just as skeptical. But right now, I need you to help me manage the passenger situation. People are going to notice the engine failure, and they're going to be scared." Frank Wilson had taken over monitoring the engine displays and was calling out critical information that Rebecca needed for the single-engine approach. "Fuel flow is stable on the left engine. Hydraulics are showing normal pressure. Flight controls are responding normally." Helen Garcia was managing radio communications with ground support, coordinating with Boeing technical advisors who were providing real-time assistance with systems procedures. They're recommending approach speed of 145 knots, flaps at 30 degrees, and gear deployment at 3 miles final. As the Massachusetts coastline grew larger in the windscreen, Rebecca realized that she was about to attempt one of the most challenging landings in commercial aviation, a single-engine approach in an aircraft she'd never flown before, with 127 lives, depending on skills she'd developed in a completely different type of flying, using procedures she was learning in real time. But for the first time since the crisis began, she felt the quiet confidence that had made her one of the Navy's most trusted pilots. She had competent people supporting her, adequate aircraft systems still functioning, and a kind of challenge that demanded everything she'd learned about flying under pressure. The hardest part was yet to come, but Rebecca Martinez was no longer pretending to be just another passenger. She was an aviator again, responsible for bringing her aircraft and crew home safely, and determined to prove that some skills transcended the boundaries of official certification and institutional approval. At 5,000 feet with Boston, Logan International Airport, visible through the windscreen, Flight 447 had become a test of everything Rebecca had learned about flying under impossible conditions. The failed right engine created a constant pull to the right that required continuous correction. The remaining engine was working harder than designed, and every system on the aircraft was operating under stress conditions that pushed both machine and pilot toward their operational limits. Rebecca found herself drawing on muscle memory that she'd thought was buried after 5 years of civilian life. The precise rudder pressure needed to maintain heading with asymmetric thrust. The power management techniques that kept the remaining engine within safe operating parameters. The constant scan of instruments that revealed the aircraft's condition before problems became critical. These were skills that had been developed through thousands of hours of practice, refined through combat operations, and proven through emergencies that had tested her capabilities under conditions far more dangerous than commercial aviation. But this was also different from military flying in ways that created new challenges. Military aircraft were designed for single-pilot operation under emergency conditions, with systems that could be managed by one person making rapid decisions. Commercial aircraft assume crew coordination, multiple people sharing workload, and procedures that depended on communication between pilots who knew each other's capabilities and limitations. "Frank," she called to Wilson, who had positioned himself where he could monitor both engine displays and navigation instruments. "I need you to handle all radio communications with ground control. My hands are full with flying the aircraft." "Roger," Wilson replied, immediately taking over the communication responsibilities. His familiarity with commercial aviation procedures and terminology made him the natural choice for coordinating with controllers who were managing not just their emergency approach, but the complex task of keeping other aircraft safely separated. From Flight 447's unpredictable flight path, Helen Garcia had taken over monitoring cabin conditions and passenger management, working with Ashley Turner to maintain calm while preparing for what everyone understood might be a very rough landing. The engine failure had been impossible to hide from passengers, and the changed sound and vibration of the aircraft made it clear that they were dealing with a serious emergency rather than routine mechanical problems. Agent Coleman's role had evolved from skeptical authority figure to tactical coordinator, managing the multiple variables that could affect their landing beyond the purely aviation concerns. He was monitoring federal law enforcement communications, coordinating with airport security about the potential terrorism investigation, and maintaining awareness of threats that could complicate their emergency even after a successful landing. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm getting reports that there may be media attention when we land. Someone leaked information about the pilot incapacitation and emergency takeover. You might want to be prepared for that." Rebecca almost laughed at the absurdity of worrying about media coverage while trying to land a crippled aircraft, but she understood Coleman's point. A storied former military pilot taking control of commercial flight would inevitably become public, and her court-martial record would be scrutinized by people who had never faced the kind of split-second decisions that aviation emergencies demanded. "Agent Coleman," she replied, "if we don't land this aircraft safely, media attention will be the least of our problems. Let's focus on getting everyone home alive first." Boston Approach Control's voice filled the cockpit with instructions that brought them closer to the critical phase of the emergency. "United 447, you're cleared for straight-in approach to runway 4 right. Wind is 090 at 12 knots. Visibility 10 miles. Ceiling 3,000 feet. Emergency equipment is standing by." "Boston Approach, United 447 cleared for approach," Wilson responded. "Single engine, 127. Souls on board, fuel sufficient for one approach attempt." The finality of that last statement, "one approach attempt," highlighted the stakes they were facing. Unlike military operations, where alternate airfields and additional fuel provided multiple options, commercial flights operated with much smaller safety margins. If Rebecca couldn't get the aircraft safely on the ground during this approach, their alternatives would be extremely limited. At 3,000 feet, she began configuring the aircraft for landing, deploying flaps and stages, and monitoring how the single remaining engine responded to the increased drag and power requirements. The 737 was heavier than the fighter aircraft she was used to, with different flight characteristics and energy management requirements that demanded constant adjustment of her technique. "Helen," she called, "I need you to monitor airspeed and call out any deviations." Single-engine approaches require very precise speed control. "Airspeed 160 knots on target," Helen replied. "Descent rate 800 feet per minute. Slightly high but manageable." Frank Wilson was coordinating with the Boeing technical advisors who were providing real-time support from the ground. They're recommending gear deployment at 3 miles final, flaps to landing configuration at 2 miles, and target speed of 145 knots over the threshold. As they descended through 2,000 feet, Rebecca could see Boston Logan spread out below them, runways, terminal buildings, and the emergency vehicles that were positioning themselves along their approach path. Red lights and flashing strobes marked the locations of fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue equipment that everyone hoped would be unnecessary, but everyone knew might be critical. The aircraft shuddered as she deployed the landing gear, and immediately the flight characteristics changed again. More drag, different control responses, increased workload for the remaining engine. She adjusted power settings and trim to maintain the precise flight path that would bring them safely to the runway. 2 miles final, Wilson announced. Emergency equipment reports ready. Tower clears us to land. Wind still 090 at 12. Rebecca could feel the tension throughout the aircraft as passengers realized they were in the final phase of an emergency landing that would either save their lives or end them. In the cockpit, the professional calm that has sustained them through. The crisis was giving way to the focused intensity that marked the difference between routine operations and life-or-death situations. 1 mile final, Helen called out. Airspeed 148 knots on glide path. Looking good. Through the windscreen, runway 4 right grew larger and more defined, the white centerline stripes that would guide them to safety becoming clearer with each second. But Rebecca could also see the crosswind conditions that would make the single-engine landing even more challenging, requiring precise control inputs at the moment when the aircraft would be most vulnerable. Half-mile final, Wilson announced. Emergency equipment reports all stations ready. Rebecca made final adjustments to power and attitude, feeling the aircraft respond to her inputs with the kind of precision that marked the difference between good pilots and exceptional ones. Everything she'd learned during 15 years of military aviation was focused on the next 60 seconds, the critical phase, where all their preparation and skill would be tested against the unforgiving physics of bringing 75 tons of aircraft safely back to Earth. The runway threshold passed beneath them, and Rebecca began the landing flare that would determine whether Flight 447's emergency would end in triumph or tragedy. In the passenger cabin behind her, 127 people held their breath and trusted their lives to someone they'd never heard of until an hour ago. Someone whose qualifications existed only in her own experience and the desperate hope that competence mattered more than official certification. The moment of truth had arrived, and there would be no second chances. The final approach to runway 4 right at Boston Logan stretched ahead of Flight 47 like a narrow corridor between safety and catastrophe. At 500 feet above the ground, every decision Rebecca made would be magnified by the physics of a 75-ton aircraft moving at 145 knots with only one engine providing the power needed to maintain controlled flight. The crosswind that had been a minor concern at altitude became a major factor as they descended into the ground effect zone, where wind patterns were disrupted by buildings, terrain, and the airport infrastructure itself. Rebecca could feel the aircraft wanting to drift left, away from the runway centerline, requiring constant pressure on the rudder pedals to maintain proper alignment. Airspeed 147 knots, Helen Garcia called out, her voice steady, despite the tension that filled the cockpit. Descent rate 600 feet per minute on glide path. Frank Wilson monitored the engine parameters with the intensity of someone who understood that their single remaining power source had to perform flawlessly for the next 90 seconds. Left engine temperature normal, oil pressure good, fuel flow steady, no warning indications. Through the windscreen, the runway grew larger with each passing second, but Rebecca could see the challenge that awaited them. The crosswind was creating a crab angle that would require precise timing to correct at the moment of touchdown. Too early, and the aircraft would drift off the runway centerline. Too late, and they would land sideways, with gear that wasn't designed for side loads. At 300 feet, a new complication emerged. The wind shifted suddenly, probably due to thermal effects from the airport's heated buildings, and the aircraft lurched to the right. Rebecca corrected immediately, but the sudden control input caused the remaining engine to surge slightly, creating a momentary increase in power that pushed them above the desired glide path. "High on approach," Wilson called out, recognizing the deviation before the instruments could display it. Rate of descent insufficient. Rebecca reduced power slightly, but the single-engine configuration meant that any power reduction had immediate and dramatic effects on the aircraft's performance. Too much reduction, and they would fall below the glide path with insufficient power to recover. Too little, and they would fly over the runway with nowhere to go. 250 feet, Helen announced. Airspeed 146 knots, descent rate increasing. In the passenger cabin, Ashley Turner was making final preparations for what everyone hoped would be a normal landing, but could easily become an emergency evacuation. The passengers could see the airport through their windows now, could see the emergency vehicles tracking their approach, could feel the aircraft's behavior changing as Rebecca fought to maintain control in increasingly difficult conditions. Agent Coleman had positioned himself where he could observe both the cockpit operations and monitor radio communications with ground emergency services. What he heard confirmed that everyone on the ground understood the severity of their situation. All emergency units, aircraft on final approach with single-engine failure, an uncertified pilot in command. Prepare for possible runway excursion, fire suppression, and mass casualty response. Uncertified pilot. The words stung, but Rebecca pushed them aside. Official qualifications mattered in briefing rooms and certification boards. Here, at 200 feet above a runway with 127 lives depending on the next few seconds, only competence mattered. 200 feet, Wilson called. Looking good. The runway threshold passed beneath them, marked by precision. Approach path indicators that confirmed they were still on glide path despite the challenging conditions. But Rebecca could feel the aircraft fighting her, the asymmetric thrust creating constant pressure that required continuous correction. 150 feet, still on centerline. The critical moment was approaching. In military aviation, carrier landings were controlled crashes aircraft, hitting the deck at specific speeds and angles that civilian pilots would consider catastrophic. But commercial aviation required finesse, gradual transitions from flight to ground contact that preserved both aircraft and passengers. 100 feet, begin flare. Rebecca pulled back gently on the control yoke, reducing the aircraft's descent rate while maintaining forward speed. The single engine responded to her power adjustments, but the heavier commercial aircraft required different timing than the fighters she was used to. 50 feet, airspeed 144 knots. The runway filled the windscreen, now white centerline. Stripes and distance markers providing visual references for the final few seconds of controlled flight. But the crosswind made one final attempt to complicate their landing, pushing the aircraft left just as they entered ground effect. 30 feet, drifting left. Rebecca corrected with right rudder pressure, aligning the aircraft with the runway centerline while simultaneously managing the power and attitude changes needed for touchdown. This was the moment that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. The ability to coordinate multiple control inputs while processing rapidly changing conditions. 20 feet, centerline good. The main landing gear was seconds from contact with the runway surface. Around them, the cockpit filled with the controlled tension of people who understood that the next few seconds would determine whether months of investigation would focus on heroic emergency procedures or catastrophic failure. 10 feet, power. Coming back. Rebecca reduced power for the final time, feeling the aircraft settle toward the runway, with the kind of controlled descent that marked the difference between landing and crashing. The crosswind tried one last time to push them off course, but her rudder corrections kept them aligned with the centerline. 5 feet, looking good. Dr. Gray, who had been monitoring the unconscious pilots throughout the approach, suddenly called out with urgency that cut through the focused atmosphere of the final landing phase. Captain Price is showing signs of consciousness. His eyes are opening. The timing could not have been worse. At the critical moment when Rebecca needed absolute concentration for touchdown, the original pilot was beginning to regain awareness. If he tried to take control of the aircraft at this moment, the result would almost certainly be catastrophic. Frank, Rebecca called without taking her eyes off the runway approach. "Restrain Captain Price if necessary. I have control until we're safely on the ground. Contact," Helen announced as the main gear touched the runway surface with a firm but controlled impact that sent vibrations through the aircraft structure. The nose gear settled a second later, and Flight 447 was finally back on solid ground after an emergency that had tested everyone involved beyond their training and experience. But even as the aircraft rolled down the runway with emergency vehicles racing alongside, Rebecca knew that the hardest part of her ordeal was just beginning. Landing the aircraft had been a test of her flying skills. Now she would have to face the investigation, the media attention, and the questions about whether someone with her background should have been trusted with 127 lives in the first place. The Boeing 737's tires gripped the runway surface with the satisfying sound of controlled contact. But Rebecca knew that landing was only the beginning of the aircraft's return to safety. With only one engine operational and emergency vehicles racing alongside their rollout, she still needed to bring 75 tons of aircraft to a complete stop without losing directional control or creating new hazards for the 127 people who had just survived an emergency. That could have ended very differently. "Thrust reversers deployed," Frank Wilson called out, monitoring the engine controls as Rebecca activated the systems that would help slow their ground speed. Left engine responding normally. No warning indications. The aircraft decelerated steadily, but the single-engine configuration created an asymmetric braking situation that required constant correction to maintain centerline tracking. Rebecca applied wheel brakes carefully, feeling the aircraft respond to her inputs while monitoring speed and distance to ensure they would stop well before the end of the 10,000-foot runway. 80 knots, Helen Garcia announced, reading the airspeed indicator as it wound down through normal taxi speeds. 70 knots, 60 knots. Excellent rollout. Captain Nathan Price was indeed regaining consciousness in the right seat. His eyes open but unfocused as he struggled to understand his surroundings. Dr. Gray was monitoring his condition while preventing him from interfering with the landing rollout procedures that required Rebecca's complete attention. "Captain Price," Dr. Gray said calmly, "you've been unconscious for approximately 90 minutes. We're currently landing at Boston Logan under emergency conditions. Please remain still until we're safely stopped." Price's confusion was evident as he tried to process what had happened during his period of unconsciousness. His eyes moved from the unfamiliar woman in the captain's seat to the emergency vehicles visible through the side windows to the instrument displays that showed they were indeed on the ground and decelerating normally. Who's flying the aircraft?" he asked weakly. 40 knots, Rebecca announced, focusing on the final phase of the landing rollout. "Braking action, good. Emergency. Equipment is maintaining escort position." At 20 knots, she turned off the main runway onto a taxiway where emergency personnel could access the aircraft without interfering with normal airport operations. The moment the aircraft came to a complete stop, the cockpit filled with radio transmissions from multiple agencies wanting immediate information about crew condition, passenger status, and security situation. "Boston ground, United 447 is stopped safely on taxiway Charlie," Frank Wilson transmitted. "Single engine shutdown complete. Both original pilots incapacitated. Emergency pilot performed successful landing. Request emergency services. Approach for crew evaluation." Captain Price was becoming more alert, and his professional instincts were beginning to reassert themselves. Despite his confusion about recent events, "Ma'am," he said to Rebecca, "I need to understand who you are and under what authority you operated this aircraft." Agent Coleman stepped forward with his credentials already displayed. "Captain Price, I'm Federal Air Marshal Derek Coleman. This is Rebecca Martinez, former Navy pilot who assumed control of your aircraft when you and First Officer Shaw became incapacitated. She just executed a single-engine emergency landing that saved everyone aboard." The weight of that statement settled over the cockpit as Price began to comprehend the magnitude of what had occurred during his unconsciousness. Emergency landing, single-engine, uncertified civilian pilot. The combination should have been a recipe for disaster. Yet they were sitting safely on the ground, with apparently no injuries or aircraft damage. "Former Navy pilot?" Price asked, his voice still weak but carrying professional curiosity. "F.A. Super Hornets," Rebecca replied, finally allowing herself to relax slightly as emergency personnel began approaching the aircraft. 15 years of military aviation, including carrier operations and combat missions. Court-martialed 5 years ago for insubordination. Price studied her face, then looked at the instrument displays that told the story of their approach and landing engine failure warnings. Single engine configuration settings, emergency frequencies selected on the radios. Every indication confirmed that she had indeed managed a complex emergency situation with apparent competence. "The engine failure," he said. "When did that occur?" "About 15 minutes ago," Frank Wilson answered. "Right engine went from warning indications to complete failure during our approach phase. She handled it like she'd been flying 737s for years." First Officer Megan Shaw was also beginning to show signs of consciousness, her eyes opening slowly as Dr. Gray continued his medical evaluation of both pilots. "Same symptoms as Captain Price," the doctor reported. "Gradual return to awareness, no apparent neurological deficits, but they'll both need comprehensive medical evaluation to determine what caused the simultaneous incapacitation." Emergency personnel reached the aircraft and began their systematic approach to ensuring that the crisis was truly over. Hazmat teams prepared to test for chemical or biological contamination. FBI agents coordinated with airport security about the potential terrorism investigation. Medical personnel stood ready to evaluate both crew and passengers for any health issues related to the suspected poisoning. But in the cockpit, a different kind of recognition was taking place. Ashley Turner, who had maintained professional composure throughout the crisis, finally allowed her emotions to show. "Ma'am," she said to Rebecca, "I don't know how to thank you for what you did. When both pilots went unconscious, I thought we were all going to die." Louise Morales, the young flight attendant who had been thrust into cockpit operations beyond his training, looked at Rebecca with the kind of respect typically reserved for people who had performed genuine heroics. "You made it look easy," he said. "But I was watching the instruments. I know how difficult that landing was." Helen Garcia, whose private pilot experience had given her insight into the complexity of what Rebecca had accomplished, was more specific in her praise. "Single engine. Approaching an aircraft you'd never flown before, with crosswind conditions and a failed engine. That was exceptional flying by any standard." Agent Coleman's assessment carried the weight of federal law enforcement authority. "Ma'am, I've seen a lot of people claim expertise they don't possess. You demonstrated skills under pressure that probably saved 127 lives. Whatever happened in your military career, what you did today was outstanding." As emergency personnel prepared to evacuate the aircraft for medical evaluation and security screening, Rebecca realized that the most difficult part of her ordeal was about to begin. The flying was over, but now she would face questions about her background, her authority to take control of the aircraft, and her decision-making during a crisis that had no clear precedent in commercial aviation procedures. Captain Price, now fully conscious but still weak from his unexplained incapacitation, made a statement that would later prove crucial in the official investigation. "Based on what I'm seeing here," he said, looking at the instrument readings and emergency equipment outside, Whoever landed this aircraft did so competently and professionally. I want that on the record." The recognition felt strange after 5 years of anonymity, but Rebecca understood that her actions during the past 2 hours had irrevocably changed her life. She was no longer the invisible former pilot trying to blend into civilian society. She was someone who had proven that competence and courage mattered more than official certification when lives were at stake. The question now was whether the system that had rejected her 5 years ago would be willing to acknowledge that sometimes the most important qualifications couldn't be measured by traditional standards. 3 months after Flight 447, the aviation industry had fundamentally changed how it thought about emergency preparedness, crew training, and the utilization of expertise that existed outside traditional certification boundaries. Rebecca Martinez had become more than an individual success story. She had become a catalyst for institutional transformation that would benefit aviation safety for decades to come. The FBI's investigation had identified Marcus Webb, a disgruntled former airline employee who had deliberately poisoned the pilot's coffee in an attempt to cause a catastrophic accident. His conviction for terrorism and attempted murder provided legal vindication for Rebecca's actions, but more importantly, it sparked comprehensive changes in aviation security procedures. United Airlines had offered Rebecca a position as Director of Emergency Operations Training, creating a new role specifically designed around her unique combination of military experience and demonstrated competence under pressure. The Martinez Protocol, as it became known throughout the industry, established procedures for identifying passengers with relevant aviation experience during emergencies and integrating their capabilities into crew resource management when qualified flight crew members were incapacitated. The Navy had reopened her court-martial case, and Admiral Patricia Hayes personally delivered the review board's conclusion to Rebecca at her new office in Denver. "Major Martinez," the Admiral said, using the rank that had been restored by the finalist board's decision. "Your original court-martial was based on an incomplete understanding of the tactical situation you faced. Your actions prevented a training accident that would have resulted in the loss of 2 aircraft and 2 pilots. The conviction is hereby overturned. Your rank is restored, and you are offered the opportunity to return to active duty with full honors." Rebecca's response surprised everyone who had followed her story. "Admiral, I'm grateful for the Navy's recognition, but I found a different way to serve. The work I'm doing here, training commercial pilots for emergency situations they hope never to face, uses everything I learned in the military while helping to prevent future tragedies like Flight 4-4-7. The annual Rebecca Martinez Aviation Safety Symposium had become one of the industry's premier events, drawing speakers and attendees from around the world. During her keynote address to the 3rd annual symposium, Rebecca reflected on how much had changed since that December afternoon when she had been just another passenger trying to blend into anonymity. The lesson of Flight 447, she told the audience of pilots, air traffic controllers, safety officials, and emergency responders, isn't that people should exceed their authority or ignore established procedures. The lesson is that we all have a responsibility to prepare ourselves for challenges we hope never to face, and that institutions have a responsibility to recognize competence wherever it exists." Standing before hundreds of aviation professionals from around the world, Rebecca realized that her story had become proof that preparation, competence, and courage could overcome institutional barriers when supported by people willing to recognize capability over credentials. The court-martial that had ended her military career was now remembered as an institutional failure rather than personal disgrace. The systems changes that had emerged from Flight 447 would benefit aviation safety for generations, ensuring that future crises could be managed by utilizing all available expertise rather than being limited by traditional boundaries. The woman who had once been told that her judgment couldn't be trusted had proven that sometimes the most important decisions were made by people who were willing to act when action was required, regardless of whether they had official permission to do so. Her legacy would be measured not just in lives saved, but in systems transformed to better utilize the human potential that existed far beyond the boundaries of formal recognition. Rebecca Martinez had learned that true qualification came not from certificates or official approval, but from the willingness to prepare for moments that might never come and the courage to act when they did. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Captain Nathan Price, who had recovered fully from his poisoning, sought out Rebecca 6 months after the incident. They met at a small cafe near Denver International Airport, where the sound of aircraft taking off provided a fitting backdrop to their conversation. "I've been flying for 23 years, Price said, stirring his coffee, a gesture that still made him pause, remembering how close he'd come to never waking up. "I've seen a lot of pilots, worked with some of the best in the industry, but you did that day. That wasn't just good flying. That was something else entirely." Rebecca looked out the window at a United 737 climbing into the Colorado sky, probably carrying passengers who had no idea that their safety depended on lessons learned from Flight 447. "I was just doing what needed to be done," she replied. "What anyone with the training would have done." Price shook his head. "No. Anyone with the training would have followed procedures, called for help, waited for instructions. You made decisions. You took responsibility. You saved our lives when the system failed." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The military threw you away for showing exactly the kind of judgment that saved 127 people. That says more about the system than it does about you." As their conversation continued, Rebecca realized that her story had become something larger than personal vindication. It had become proof that competence could emerge from unexpected places, that heroism often came from people who had been overlooked or dismissed by traditional institutions. The passengers of Flight 447 had formed an informal association that met annually to commemorate their shared experience. At their second reunion, held in the same Boston hotel, where they'd been questioned by federal agents, the group presented Rebecca with a simple plaque that meant more to her than any official recognition. "To Major Rebecca Martinez," the inscription read, "who proved that the most important qualifications can't be found in any manual. With gratitude from the 127 souls aboard Flight 447. Frank Wilson, the retired airline pilot who had assisted during the emergency, stood to address the group. "I want everyone here to understand something," he said, his voice carrying the authority of decades in commercial aviation. What Rebecca did that day was unprecedented in civilian aviation. Single-engine approach in an unfamiliar aircraft with engine failure during the most critical phase of flight, while managing crew coordination and passenger safety. The textbooks say it can't be done. She did it anyway. Helen Garcia, the flight instructor who had monitored instruments during the approach, added her own perspective. "I've taught hundreds of student pilots over the years. I know the difference between someone who knows procedures and someone who understands flying. Rebecca doesn't just know how to fly. She understands flight at a level that can't be taught. It can only be earned through experience that most of us will never have." Agent Coleman, who had been promoted within the Federal Air Marshal Service, partly based on his handling of the incident, spoke about the broader implications of Rebecca's story. "In law enforcement, we're trained to assess threats and capabilities quickly. When lives are at stake, you learn to recognize competence regardless of credentials. What Rebecca demonstrated wasn't just flying skill, it was leadership under pressure, decision-making in chaos, and the ability to coordinate resources when traditional authority structures had failed. Dr. Gray, whose medical expertise had been crucial during the crisis, reflected on the teamwork that had made their survival possible. Rebecca couldn't have saved us alone, he pointed out. It took all of us working together, flight attendants, passengers, ground controllers, emergency responders. But she was the catalyst that made everything else possible. Without her willingness to step forward when others couldn't, none of our contributions would have mattered. Ashley Turner, now United's Director of Crew Emergency Training, had perhaps the most personal perspective on Rebecca's impact. Before Flight 447, I thought I knew what emergency procedures looked like. I'd been trained, certified, drilled on every conceivable scenario. But when both pilots were unconscious and we were facing a situation that wasn't in any manual, I realized that training can only take you so far. At some point, you need people who can think beyond the procedures, who can adapt when the unexpected happens. Luis Morales, the young flight attendant who had been thrust into the cockpit, had gone on to become a pilot himself, inspired by what he'd witnessed during the emergency. Rebecca showed me that aviation isn't just about following checklists, he said. It's about understanding the principles behind the procedures, so you can make good decisions when the checklists don't cover your situation. As the evening wore on and passengers shared their memories of that December day, Rebecca found herself thinking about the strange path that had led her from court-martial to vindication. The same independent judgment that had ended her military career had ultimately saved more lives than any mission she'd flown in uniform. Marcus Webb, the terrorist who had poisoned the pilots, was serving multiple life sentences in federal prison. His case had led to enhanced security procedures for airline personnel and stricter controls on access to aircraft crew areas. But Rebecca knew that no security system could prevent every possible threat, which was why having competent people ready to respond when systems failed would always be necessary. The changes that had emerged from Flight 447 extended far beyond aviation. Military justice procedures had been reformed to better account for officers who violated orders to save lives. Emergency response protocols had been updated to recognize expertise that existed outside traditional certification boundaries. Training programs across multiple industries had incorporated lessons about utilizing available human resources during crisis situations. But for Rebecca, the most meaningful change was personal. After 5 years of trying to disappear into civilian anonymity, she had rediscovered her purpose, not as someone who followed orders, but as someone who prepared others to make good decisions when clear guidance wasn't available. Standing in her office at the United Training Facility, surrounded by simulators where pilots learned to handle emergencies they hoped never to face, Rebecca often thought about the morning she boarded Flight 447 as just another passenger. She had been running from a past that defined her by her failures rather than her capabilities. Now she understood that her court-martial hadn't been the end of her story. It had been the beginning of a different kind of service, one that proved competence mattered more than credentials, judgment mattered more than obedience, and courage could emerge from the most unlikely sources when it was needed most. The woman who had been stripped of her military identity for saving 2 lives had gone on to save 127 more, and in doing so, had transformed how an entire industry thought about expertise, authority, and the human potential that existed far beyond the boundaries of official recognition. Rebecca Martinez's story had become proof that sometimes the most important qualifications couldn't be found in any personnel file. They could only be revealed when everything else failed, and someone had to step forward with nothing but their competence, their courage, and their willingness to accept responsibility for outcomes that would affect the lives of others. In the end, that had proven to be enough. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.